Hi and welcome back if you've watched any of the previous videos. My name is Tim Spees and I am serving as a guide to the most important journey any human being can take, which is to help you, the viewer, find answers to the most important questions of life. In previous videos we concluded, using observation and deductive reasoning, that a designer of the human race must exist. Last time we looked at some issues with finding the designer of the human race. We looked at how the designer might communicate with us. We took another look at religion and saw that the vast majority of religious content is based merely on speculation about that designer. We observed that using reason in regard to testing religious beliefs is not a popular practice, and this leads to many variations of beliefs among the people who populate the planet. Stated another way, people are either less capable or don't care enough to diligently use reason to examine their God beliefs to see if they are actually true. We observe that while metaphysical things cannot be validated physically by observation, concepts, principles, or beliefs can be validated as true or false using reason and logic. For example, consider this mathematical statement: 1 plus 1 does not equal 4. There are no physical things to validate that statement, but our mind, using reason, tells us that it is a true statement. Here's another example from the realm of God claims. Our God says, love other people, and we can harm them as well, unquote. That statement contains a contradiction and thus is false. In other words, loving other people and harming those people are contradictory or mutually exclusive. You cannot both love another person and at the same time intentionally harm them. Therefore, for that God claim statement, only 4 possibilities exist. Number 1, God does not exist and a poorly reasoning person made the whole principle up. Number 2, God contradicts himself and cannot reason well. Number 3, God said love one another and man added the harm clause. Or number 4, God said harm one another and man added the love clause. If people who hold to God beliefs would apply reason in this manner more diligently to their God beliefs, there would be a whole lot fewer God claims as well as less confusion and division. Finally, we concluded that if the designer wanted to communicate to we his creations, and for whatever reason he or she could not do that directly, either due to some physical constraint like the designer existing in a dimension that prevented communication that could be received or understood by the physical means we have, or due to some metaphysical constraint like humans' inability to receive the designer's communications due to some problem with my nature or with my will, then he or she would use the best indirect means possible to ensure that his or her message was properly understood. From the last video, we concluded that the best means of indirect communication would be to send another messenger, to have face-to-face communication with the other person. Therefore, if the designer for whatever reason could not do that him or herself, and he or she could send a representative who could deliver his or her message, that would be best. So that leaves us with trying to figure out who, if anyone, is that representative. And as we saw in a previous video, there have been and are millions of people who claimed or currently claim to speak for the designer or God, and many millions of God claims. Using reason, we can eliminate many of those gods and the religions associated with them. For example, we can eliminate gods that do not have the capacity to design and create the human race. We can eliminate gods that do not have the capacity, or gods who are quoted in contradictions, for they at best, if they exist, would not be worth listening to. Furthermore, any God claims that cannot pass the test of reason should be eliminated. For example, perhaps the key belief of many Christian sects is the Trinity doctrine, which states essentially that God is one God but 3 gods, or stated more simply, that 1 equals 3. All the theological equivocation with associated complicated vocabulary used to hide the contradiction notwithstanding, 1 does not equal 3. Thus, the Trinity belief ought to be rejected as false. Some of the earth's religions with many adherents include Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Judaism. There are hundreds of more beliefs and practices that people hold that could be considered religion, but the 5 mentioned above probably account for over 75% of the humans on the earth, so we will address them. In addition to the 5 major religions themselves, there are many hundreds of divisions in each of those 5 religions, so any pretext of unity should be rejected. However, the main point is who is correct. Muslims say Muhammad is God's messenger. Buddhists look to Siddhartha Gautama. Jews look to Moses and their prophets as God's messengers. Christians say Christ, but this author has found that the Christians' Christ does not represent Jesus of Nazareth, and many Christians spend most of their time quoting anyone but him, especially Paul. In addition to those people who lived in the past, there are all the living people today who say they are God's messengers. So again, who is correct? How can we validate those claims? Do they all speak for God? What about the many contradictions between each of those supposed messengers and their messages? As we have seen and agreed, if something that can be evaluated by reason cannot pass the test of reason, then we will not consider it. For we should not be interested in believing things that are false. So getting back to someone representing God and our ability to know what the designer is like, where do we go from here? God could be anything from a non-caring, apathetic, distant being who sees his human creation as an afterthought, to a being passionate about his created beings. So, what is the designer like? Remember, we need a way to validate that the messenger is actually sent from and actually represents the designer. Anyone can claim anything, so how could we validate that? A primary way that validation could be accomplished would be if the designer gave his messenger special powers that other people did not have. If the designer's messenger could do things that no one else could, then that would be good evidence that the person's claims, if they also claimed to represent the designer, were true. Another way would be if the messenger could prove that he or she could see into the future, or if things about them that were communicated long ago were now being fulfilled by them. Things they could not manipulate and thus fulfill by their own will. Thus they would have proof that they were not bound by time, and thus would be a likely candidate for someone who knows the designer if the designer exists outside of time or can see through time. Perhaps the least objective and yet one of the more effective validations is if the messenger's message is validated by our conscience. That is to say that we know the things they teach or taught are right and true, for who can argue with truth? This becomes especially important with any God claims they made or make. So again, where does this leave us? Let's add another layer of possibility to this puzzle of finding the designer's spokesperson. What if the designer's messenger said things that were so unpopular that the people who heard them would naturally withdraw away and not want to consider or receive the message? What if the designer provided a singular messenger and a clear message that could not be reasonably misunderstood unless the people who heard it were afraid of the message and the message's implications on their lives? In other words, what if the designer sent a messenger or messengers, but people in general don't want to hear the message? If that was so, then the human race would have a non-physical deafness, so to speak, that would work hard against identifying the messenger. Something important to consider that we'll address in future videos. That thought aside, and as we have said, we need a way to validate if a person who claimed to represent the designer did or really does. I would suggest the following criteria for validating messengers. Of the major messengers who say they were representatives from the designer of the human race, which one's message provides the key to human life being what it should be, and which messenger validated their message with an event that could not be mistaken as a sign from the designer? An event or feat that would clearly rise above normal human experience. Here is what I suggest are the basic validations that any messenger needs to pass in order to be considered as the messenger from the designer. First, they need to have claim to speak for the designer. If the designer wants to communicate with his created beings through a messenger, then that messenger would make the claim that they speak for the Creator and would not hide or obscure who they represent. Criteria 2, or second, the messenger needs to have provided the solution to mankind's biggest problems. As we have identified in this video series, mankind's primary problem is having fear, pride, and selfishness cause us to take from, harm, unjustly rule over, and neglect others. Third, they needed to validate their person and message by an act or event that clearly marks them as extraordinary deliverers of the designer's message. I would encourage the viewer to consider these three criteria and try to find fault with them. If you cannot, then you should be really excited that by these three criteria, the designer's messenger or messengers will be revealed. Let me just say that this brief video cannot possibly, in an in-depth analysis, get into this particular topic of the claims of messengers from the designer. So you, listener, will need to do some research and homework to validate the claims made in this message. In this short video, we will only consider those alleged messengers who most of the people on the planet are looking to know God and or His will. So let's do that now. First, let's consider Islam's messenger Muhammad. Does he pass the three criteria? Muhammad certainly claimed to speak for God, so he passes the first criteria. What was his solution for mankind? It was to spread Islam, the teachings of Muhammad, who claimed to speak for God, to all humans to get them to submit to Allah, the label that they put on God, and His rules using whatever means necessary, including force or violence. Here are a few quotes of Muhammad from the Quran in that regard. Chapter 9, verse 29. Fight against Christians and Jews until they pay the tribute readily, being brought low. Unquote. Chapter 4, verse 91. If the unbelievers do not offer you peace, kill them wherever you find them. Against such you are given clear warrant. Unquote. Chapter 9, verses 7 through 9. Don't make treaties with non-Muslims. They are all evildoers and should not be trusted. Unquote. Chapter 9, verse 12 through 14. Fight the disbelievers. Allah is on your side. He will give you victory. Unquote. Chapter 9, verse 5. Kill the non-believers wherever you find them. Unquote. Chapter 2, verse 191 and 92. Kill disbelievers wherever you find them. If they attack you, then kill them. Such is the reward of disbelievers. Unquote. Chapter 5, verses 51. O you who believe, do not take the Jews and the Christians for friends. They are friends of each other. And whoever amongst you takes them for a friend, then surely he is one of them. Surely Allah does not guide the unjust people. Unquote. Chapter 2, verses 65 and 66. Christians and Jews must believe that what Allah has revealed to Muhammad, or Allah will disfigure their faces or turn them into apes as He did the Sabbath breakers. Unquote. Well, as you can see, the solution Muhammad laid out, at least the portion that we've read here, seems a bit flawed, to say the least. Using force and violence to accomplish one's goals, even if the end is said to be good, is wrong. Other teachings in the Quran, of course, provide for human leaders that the other followers of Allah must submit to, thus setting up a religious system controlled by men. Certainly claiming an angry God wants people to submit to Him and that His followers are right to use force, threat, and violence to achieve that end hardly solves mankind's problems. In fact, that kind of belief is the cause of much of the hatred and violence in the world. As a quick aside, just because many who take the religious label Muslim ignore, deny, or seek ways to avoid the plain meaning of those verses in their holy book and uttered by their prophet of God, in no way nullifies the fact that they do exist and are included in the Muslim holy book, the Quran. Nor does the fact that many Muslims renounce violence and are not aggressive or violent people negate the fact that it is reasonable that other Muslims take those sayings from Muhammad in the Quran at face value and act upon them. Finally, and the third criteria, what event did Muhammad use to validate he was a special messenger from the designer? None. He lived a normal life and died in a normal way. Thus, the supposed messenger Muhammad fails 2 of the 3 tests. Okay, what about Buddha or Siddhartha Gautama? Did he claim to speak for the Creator? No, he did not. Therefore, he is eliminated by the first criteria. Siddhartha had a good focus to his teachings, essentially to overcome and alleviate suffering. And he certainly did not teach that force or violence was justified to achieve those or any earthly ends to his credit. His solution for mankind was far less flawed than Muhammad's, but it was still too narrow and did not clearly address the root problems. Since Siddhartha did not claim to speak for the designer, he needn't have validated his person or message, and in fact he lived a relatively normal life. Okay, what about Hinduism? Did it have a founder or main messenger? No, it does not. Rather, it is a set of existential or religious philosophies only. While some of Hinduism's beliefs and philosophies seem good and right, and would help alleviate some of the problems in the world, those beliefs and philosophies cannot be validated as having come from the designer, nor do they address the root problems and clearly supply the solution. Okay, what about Judaism? If you had to pick the main messenger from Judaism's standpoint, it would have to be Moses. How does Moses do with our three criteria? He certainly claimed to have spoken for God, so he passes the first criteria. What does Moses say is the designer's solution for mankind's problems? Many Christians and some Jews would argue that the Ten Commandments are his solution, or the rules that mankind needs. However, the Ten Commandments, so-called, do not address the root problems of fear, pride, and selfishness. They merely attempt to rein in some bad behavior. Jesus of Nazareth later provided an improved version of the Ten Commandments, thus showing the original commandments were imperfect and incomplete, and thus not from a perfect being. Therefore, Moses does not pass the second criteria. What about the third criteria? Moses certainly did allegedly perform or call upon God to work miracles to validate his message to the Egyptian leadership, but notice who the validating signs were directed at: the Egyptian leadership, and not at the people of the world at large. The alleged miracles performed by the designer for Moses were of the nature of destruction and killing, of violence and force. In this way, they vary very little from the Muslims' God's way. Yes, the destructive acts against the Egyptian leadership, not any acts against the common Egyptian people, were justified from the viewpoint of the oppressed seeking relief from the unjust oppressor. But is violence the only way to achieve relief from oppression? No, it is not. See the stories of Jesus of Nazareth, Gandhi, or Martin Luther King Jr. to validate that truth. If we assume that the designer is above some of our more base desires, like harming others to get our way, then I reject that the designer would use or advocate or approve of violence to achieve various ends, even just ones. So, while Moses did allegedly perform things that would seem to validate that a super being was behind his words and actions, the words and actions of destructive violence themselves disqualify Moses. There are many others who claim to speak for God, but none of them met all three criteria except one. We will evaluate that messenger in the next video. Until next time, be real. Get past the shallowness and pretentiousness of typical American life and find what you truly need.